Kia ora whanau, welcome to another episode of the Paul and Henry Show. That's me, Paul, talking about stuff you should probably know with my good friend and colleague, Henry.
Kia ora.
Today's episode is about legal guidance for regulators.
Yeah.
So Henry's going to be doing most of the talking and I might learn a couple of things.
Very good.
I hope so.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so we thought we'd do an episode just focusing on some legal guidance and I guess a bit of an introduction to core legal concepts for regulators to know. Some of this or all of this might be familiar to you, but it's probably good to have a refresher and get your head back into this stuff. Because I want to start at the very first principle, or at sort of the highest level, which is the rule of law. Have you heard this phrase, the rule of law, before?
Don't ask me what it means.
Yeah. So I think the confusing thing about this phrase is it's not actually a rule. You know, you have the rule of thumb, or you have the hearsay rule. The rule of law is actually about being ruled by law. That law is the ruler, rather than being ruled by tyrants.
Yep.
So it's this idea that's developed in all democratic societies and civilizations over time, that instead of being ruled by tyrants, we are ruled by law. Law is the ruler. And that's the sort of the really basic concept, which is that tyrants don't tell us what to do. It has to be written in legislation. And legislation also rules the rulers themselves, right?
Yep.
So ministers and parliament and MPs and even judges and courts are all subject to the same rules as everyone else. Now, that's the core thing. Now, you can actually run a dictatorship under a rule of law, because you could have a dictator who does whatever they like, but they always do that through legislation, expressing their desires through law. So then what we have is rule of law values or principles. And
to avoid the dictatorship.
Exactly, right. And these kind of blend into ideas about democracy, but really the rule of law, the values and principles behind it, is about fairness, a version of fairness, which is around certainty and predictability. So one of the key ideas of the rule of law is that law shouldn't be retrospective, right? The law and law should be certain and knowable and available, right? So you should know what the law is today. You should be able to find out today what the law is today, and it shouldn't be changed tomorrow. Now, people might be sitting there going, but I've got heaps of examples of where the law is retrospective. Yes, we make retrospective law all the time. It's not a hard, inviolable idea in our law. It's a principle. But actually, in particular, tax legislation is often retrospective. And what the government does is they tell all of the accountants and tax practitioners that these are the new rules. They'll come into force from tomorrow, but it'll take us 9 months to change the law. And that's just how it works in the tax world. And there are lots of other examples. And another really key important part of the rule of law is an independent judiciary.
Right.
And if you look at countries where they are dictatorships and they're trying to say, we still have the rule of law, you can still find all of the law you need in our legislation. Their judiciaries are often under a lot of pressure or undue influence.
That political pressure.
Yeah. So an independent judiciary, and that's why I think sometimes when you're engaging with courts and judges, it can seem very stuffy and pompous and old-fashioned. But actually, and I'm not a fan of any of those sorts of things, but if that's what it takes to keep our judiciary independent and keep them in a special space, then so be it. So that's the rule of law. So now, you can have the rule of law without being a democracy. I just want to point that out, but of course we have both in New Zealand. We're a democracy and we have the rule of law. Now, so the idea is that anything government does, anything the state does, is ruled by law. We are under a legal framework as well. So, what's the Crown, Paul? We often hear in government circles people talk about the Crown.
What's this?
Yeah. What's the Crown? No, people just bought it by voice.
It's Rex and Regina. It's the Crown. It's the Queen.
Yeah. So, in New Zealand government, there's a great list of different government agencies on the Public Service Commission website. And I guess I will need to explain about this concept of legal personality, right? So lawyers use these strange phrases. They talk about a natural person and a legal person. So natural person is just a human, right? Yeah. And a human has legal personality. You can sue and be sued. You can enter contracts. You can own and sell property, and a whole lot of other things. And then we create legal persons like companies and some kinds of government agencies, which, when you think about it, it's a really abstract idea. Yeah. But what we do is we give these things legal personality. And oftentimes how legislation will do that is they'll say, Waka Kotahi has all the powers of a natural person, except it can only exercise them for these purposes, but except it doesn't have these particular powers. So there's lots of ways of giving legal persons powers, but the most common way is to start with anything a natural person can do and then edit down. So most regulators are Crown entities, okay? Waka Kotahi included. And that's kind of easy. We're a bit like companies. We have our own legal personality separate from civil aviation, separate from maritime, and separate from the Crown. The Crown is the centre bit of government that is its own legal person called the Crown. And there's nothing else quite like it. And every sort of analogy I've heard bugs me. The Crown is special. But what the Crown is it's the sovereign.
Yep.
So if you ever enter a contract with the Crown, often the contract will say, Her Majesty the Queen in right of New Zealand, or the modern styling is to say, the Sovereign in right of New Zealand. And on a lot of land titles too, you see HMQ, Her Majesty the Queen. And that's just the legal way of writing down the Crown. And it's all government departments. So government departments don't have their own legal personality. You don't enter a contract with MB or MSD or even IRD. You enter a contract with the sovereign and right of New Zealand acting by and through whatever government department. So all ministers, government departments, they're all part of the Crown, which means as Crown entities, we're separate from the Crown. So we can enter a contract with MB, but MSD and MB couldn't enter a contract with each other because it's the same person. Yeah. It's like walking down to your another department of your own business, of your own organisation, and saying, hey, let's enter a contract. It doesn't work. So that's why you see a lot of memorandums of understanding or MOUs. Okay, I'm convinced I've got quite carried away there, but that was me to the first point. Here's the first point. So, if you're a Crown entity, all of your legal powers start with the board. So the powers are given to the entity, New Zealand Transport Agency, as we're called in legislation, and it all starts with the board. And then the board has to delegate down. And the best way to do delegations is to have one central spreadsheet of delegations where the board delegates almost everything to the chief executive, and then the chief executive starts delegating down through the management chain and down out to the front line. And that's really important because we are part of the state. We don't have natural person powers. We only have the powers that the legislation has given us because of the rule of law and because of the legal personality. So that's why I went on such a long journey there.
I think that's all fascinating. And the key point there is that if you're exercising a statutory power, you are exercising the power of the state.
Yes.
Yep. And with that comes a weight of privilege, doesn't it?
Yep.
An obligation.
Yep.
Yeah.
And statutory comes from a statute. Statute, Act of Parliament, same thing. Just different words for the same thing.
Yep.
Now, we also have something called enforcement officers. So this can kind of confuse everything I've just said.
Brilliant.
But it's not. It's just a separate idea. So the separate idea that legislation also talks about enforcement officers, which are people, natural persons, and they can have a set of powers from legislation. And to become an enforcement officer, you get a warrant. You get a document from someone, the right person with the right delegation, to make you an enforcement officer. And that essentially is your ticket to use that set of powers in legislation. And your warrant should really list all the powers you've been given. Now, a lot of frontline regulatory staff will have both. You will have delegations which are attached to your job title from your sort of corporate delegations register, and you will have an enforcement officer warrant with your name on it that is specific to you. So if you go on leave and somebody acts in your role, they'll get your delegations because they go with the role. They won't get your warrant because that's in your name.
So am I right, Henry, that one way to think about this is if I'm exercising a delegation, I'm standing in the shoes of the director and the Crown and the state?
Not the Crown.
Not the Crown, just the state.
So if it's Waka Kotahi,
Yep.
you are standing in the shoe. You're either doing it on behalf of the director,
Yep.
because we confusingly have some powers that go to our director and get delegated down, and then we also have powers that go to the agency, which go to the board
Right.
and get delegated down. So you're standing in their shoes.
Right. And if I'm exercising powers under a warrant, I'm standing in my own shoes.
Yes, so you are. But you're still doing that as an employee
Yes.
of Waka Kotahi.
So I still have to play by all of the rules.
That's right. Now, I thought you were going to ask about personal liability.
No.
Okay, but what you need to know is, essentially, wherever you are in government, you will be protected by bits of legislation which say, if you are in good faith doing your job, then you can't be personally liable.
Right.
That is the basic principle. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to that, but it's important that you are acting in your job. If you decide that actually you are going to go in and uncover some huge international drug conspiracy, that's not part of your job. That's not our functions. So you will be straying into a dangerous area, and you have to be acting in good faith.
Yeah.
So that's pretty clear.
I think that's a good segue into the points I wanted to make about this from a real practical perspective. I encourage everybody, I always say this, know your powers. They are the tools of your trade. They are the bread and butter of what you do. If you were a mechanic, you would know your tools. An engineer, you know your tools. You're a regulator, know your tools really well. And also know the obligations that you're under, because sometimes those powers come with obligations, and you also have some general obligations as well, which we've talked about in all of our other episodes, I think. But really know those things. So but if you, and also know what you don't know. Like, or I always say with the legal people, engage with them early. Like, if you're not sure and you don't know, go and ask. It's much better to do that and have the legal advice supporting you than it is to be going to the legal people saying, can you fix this thing that I've got wrong?
Yeah, totally.
And you've done all that work and
that's right.
It's wasted because you haven't done something right.
Yeah.
So engage really early, I think is a good thing. Know your powers, know them inside out. You shouldn't, that should be off the cuff. I know what I can and can't do here. That's super helpful if you take the time to learn that. When you're out in the field and something happens, you go, I know how I can deal with this, rather than I've got to go back to the office and get some legal advice.
Yeah, that's right.
But there's nothing wrong with doing that if you're not sure.
Yes, exactly.
And
Now,
I think the thing you said, about good faith and fairness, if you keep those things front in mind, if you're still not 100% sure, fall back on those things, If you have to deal with it and you haven't got time to go and get your legal advice, what's the right thing to do here? It seems fair, it seems reasonable.
Yeah.
I'm on the right track.
Yeah, and in terms of things we have to do as a regulator, like enter premises or enter sites, work sites, interview and talk to people, get documents, take photos of equipment or film things, you've either got the powers in legislation or you don't.
Yeah.
And if you've got the powers in legislation, you should know them and be able to explain them to the people you're dealing with. why you can't do that? Yes, I can because of section
Of course.
blah de blah. If you don't have those powers and you aren't able to kind of cite them if asked, then you need to be really clear that their cooperation is voluntary. And we've talked about this with interviewing people in voluntary interviews. But you need to be clear with people that if you don't have a power to do something, but you look very official, you don't want people to think they have. It's not fair.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the other thing I'd point out is, oftentimes there are offences of obstructing an enforcement officer or obstructing a rail safety officer or whatever it is. That doesn't mean, because that offence exists, that doesn't mean you have a whole lot of powers to make people do what you say and cooperate with you. You should, if you're having a really hard time dealing with someone or on a site visit, maybe in the back of your mind you need to go, actually, I need to start taking some good notes or evidence in case we want to...
About the obstruction.
About the obstruction. Yeah. But most times, if somebody says, nah, I'm not telling, no, you can't look at that.
It's not obstruction.
If you don't have the power to demand it and they don't want to do it, that's not necessarily obstruction. And because you are exercising the powers of state, because what you do can have serious consequences for people, that means there's a lot of things that a natural person could do, a private citizen could do, which you can't do. And in particular, if you want to do some filming and surveillance, talk to your legal team. It gets a bit messy, and different agencies or different managers will have a different risk appetite around this stuff. But you could go and stick a camera with a big long lens on a hill and film somebody's work site. And that may or may not be a breach of privacy laws and things. If you're filming into a public place, like an outdoor area, I'm imagining. Doesn't necessarily mean you can do it as a regulator, so just please be careful about that stuff.
Henry, you've made me think of something really quite important and probably quite relevant to Waka Kotahi. And that you're talking about being clear about what you can do, but there's sometimes I think regulators can get themselves in trouble if they have the powers to do things and they don't exercise them. And I hate to say it, but Dargaville Diesel is probably a good example. Waka Kotahi had the powers to be closing down that operation, shutting their doors and stopping them from continuing to operate, but they chose not to exercise their powers. So I think there's a really, I think that reinforces, if anything, the need to absolutely know what your powers are and what you can and can't do, because that's where you can get yourself in trouble, is if you don't do something and you should have done it and you could have done it, but you weren't sure, and then something else goes wrong.
Yeah.
And it's called regulatory failure, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it reminded me, you don't need a special power to write someone a letter.
No.
If all else fails, if we want to stop something or regulate something, change someone's behaviour, force them to change, and we don't have the tool in the toolbox, we don't have the power, we can still make some noise.
Of course.
Write a letter, get someone very big and important to write the letter, to tell people we're worried about what you're doing, we think it's unsafe or inappropriate, and we think that you should stop. You can always do that.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. The worst thing you do is nothing.
The worst thing you do is nothing. I mean, there's people we don't actually have any powers over. They haven't come into our, one of our regulated parties, but we can still write them a letter.
Of course.
Yeah. I had another brilliant thought, which has just escaped me again. Oh, yes, that's right. I wanted to talk about blackmail. It's my final parting gift on this episode. Look, occasionally people will tell you, or lawyers will write to you and say, you are blackmailing my client and you should be very careful because I'll go to the cops and you'll go down for blackmail. Oftentimes that's a big bluff, but there is a line that you don't want to get too close to, which is what would be a really strong example of blackmail? Can I look at all those records, please? Do you have a warrant or a power to get them? No, I don't, but I'd like to look at them. Well, no, you can't look at them. Well, if you don't let me look at those warrants,
those papers.
I'm going to prosecute you, and I'm going to bleed you dry, and I'm going to make this business go under and go bankrupt, and you'll wish you never met me. I will take you down. Now,
That's what you don't say.
that's what you don't say. Now,
So
that
really
is
clear. Never say
obviously inappropriate for a number of reasons, but that's getting pretty close to or is blackmail, which is a threat that you're going to take legal action or punish someone if they don't do something that they don't actually have to do.
Yeah.
What you can say to someone is, for example, in a notice of proposal to revoke, these are the things we would need to see from you for you to be able to keep your license. If you're unable to demonstrate that to us, we will look at our options, but one of our powers would be to revoke your license.
But again, you're explaining the consequences inside of your powers and what you can do.
That's right.
That's what you're saying. As soon as you start stepping over that line,
Yeah.
you're getting into some dangerous territory.
It's when you start making threats. It's if you don't do this, then this bad thing will happen. That sort of absolute language of you must do this or this will happen, that it can get close to being blackmail. So,
But nothing wrong with doing that if it's inside of your rights to be doing that. If you don't install this piece of equipment, we will shut your door so you can no longer issue a warrant of fitness. If you've got a lawful obligation to have that piece of equipment, then that's fine. Everything's inside of the rules.
yeah.
But when you start stepping out of them, isn't it, when you start to get in trouble?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if we're telling people how to comply, or saying, and if you don't comply, you're going to lose your license, that is the business of being a regulator. That's not blackmail. But, those, occasionally you might get that, somebody's accusing you of blackmail. Have a chat to the legal team if you need to, but normally they're really stretching.
Bluffing.
Stretching it.
Awesome.
That's it from me, Paul.
Thank you, Henry. Nothing else from me. I think that was really helpful. Very good to hear that explanation of how it all works with the Crown and having legal entities and personalities. I think that's fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you, whānau. That was legal guidance for regulators. Ka kite.
Thank you, Jack.